As creative as Nautlon's kits have been thus far, they've also been pretty restrictive in many aspects due to one core feature, Nightsoul. So today, I wanted to raise this question: is Nightsoul poorly designed? My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Now the thing is, every region has some sort of gimmick. In Sumeru's case, Dendro was the gimmick. It was a brand new element. In Fontaine's case, there were lots of little mechanics to do with HP manipulation. There was also Numa and Ouija, however, those weren't really big deals in my opinion, they were just kinda there. Inazuma, if I remember correctly, didn't have any insane bells and whistles either. It was as simple as this. Most characters that came out at the time would have a pretty high burst cost, because the Archon of that region represented energy and energy recharge. Nightsoul feels especially gimmicky. The reason why I raised the question of it being poorly designed is because it feels like such a wild departure from the usual types of quote-unquote regional gimmicks that Genshin tends to do. The best way to put it is think about Pokemon. Mega Evolution, Z-moves, Dynamaxing, and Terrestrializing. I think most people will agree with me when I say that Mega Evolutions are the absolute best gimmick of all time. They shouldn't even be considered a gimmick, those things should be a core mechanic. Z-moves are very mid. Terrestrializing is really cool, but below Megas. And then what is Dynamaxing? I consider Nightsoul to be the Dynamaxing of Genshin gimmicks, essentially. Because functionally, when you see how Nightsoul works in-game, it pretty much only ever serves to restrict the teams of characters, or to try and make you play them in certain teams of other Nautlon characters. I'm not really sure why they went for this. If they wanted to do the whole Nightsoul bursts thing, and have characters that rely on Nightsoul bursts within their kit to offer more flexibility, they didn't need Nightsoul as a mechanic to do that. Numa and Ouija didn't need some kind of special Fontaine bar in order to work. To be fair, those mechanics were far smaller in that region, but that's because they didn't have to be any bigger. It was pretty much an additional tool to help characters deal with Fontaine-specific enemies better, and if you played a character that wasn't from Fontaine against a Fontainian boss, guess what? You would still be fine. You could have ignored the whole Numa and Ouija thing for the entirety of Fontaine, and you would have been completely good to go. Whereas in Nautlon, you have bosses like the Tenebra's Papilla, which, while you can absolutely deal with them without using Nightsoul, the bias is very evident. It is way faster if you just use Nautlon characters. Then you have situations like Moika. She is the most restrictive Archon that has ever released. Most Archons have a couple of key features. They're the strongest of their time period, they're really good for all units in their respective region, and they're also very versatile. In Moika's case, you really want to use Shilonen with her. The only thing that Nightsoul has really done to contribute towards game balance is make sure that only Nautlon characters can use the two Nautlon artifact sets. However, here's the thing, Obsidian Codex is just hunters, but with 4% more crit rate. Every character, every other DPS character outside of Nautlon, can still access very similar buffs if they just wear 4-piece hunters. That might have been Genshin trying to avoid making hunters obsolete right in the next region over after everybody had farmed that domain to death. And in fairness, Cinder City is a really good artifact set. So they were like, okay, we need to restrict this to just Nautlon characters, and we need to make sure that it can only be procced once per team. Okay, fine. But I still feel like they didn't have to literally invent an entirely new type of mechanic to deal with this issue. Look at Lithic Spear as an example, right? Its passive only works when you have multiple Leeway characters in your team. So in the past, Hoyoverse has indeed just written a region and been like, okay, that's fine. So they could have just as easily went to these artifact set descriptions and written, only Nautlon characters can use these sets. Problem solved. I just don't think that Nightsoul really added anything enriching to combat. I'm not gonna pretend like Bond of Life was super revolutionary either. It was pretty random, but it was still interesting because of how healers were hyped up throughout all of Fontaine, and then they give you these characters that cannot be healed externally, but have self-healing within their own kits. It was a cool gimmick that would sort of throw off your expectations. Kept things from getting a bit formulaic, if you will. Now I will say, sometimes they did not know what to do with this. I still don't know who at Hoyoverse wrote Siege Queen's passive or what they were cooking with that, but maybe one day we'll understand what their great vision was and we'll all be laughed at then. Think about it like this. I would say that Fontaine's main gimmick did enrich the meta, because healers, while they have absolutely been getting better and better over time, Fontaine was able to take healers and turn them mainstream. That was super interesting. No one would have ever expected that to happen before. Dendro, when that came to the game, it also did a whole lot of things that we would have absolutely never thought about happening in a million years. For example, Kaching being good. You have to have been there for how bad Kaching was. She was the butt of every joke. Nightsoul isn't really enriching any meta as much as it is just locking characters into a very specific part of the meta. That's not to say that all Nautlon characters cannot work outside of Nautlon teams, because all of the supports thus far can in fact work in teams with other characters. For example, Autoron doesn't have to work in Nightsoul teams, he can also work in just general Taser. You don't have to use Shieldon with Nautlon characters, you can use her very easily with characters from other regions, she has absolutely no restrictions and such. Lolly, she only asks to be put with Pyro and Hydro characters, so I could be overblowing this all a little bit. Even Kinich himself doesn't really care too much about Nightsoul, more so as he cares about having consistent burning application. But I'm more so just trying to point out how Nightsoul really hasn't done much for Genshin, if that makes sense. I feel like they could have came up with something better, or it shouldn't have been as integral and core as it is. If there is one aspect where it absolutely is relevant, it's exploration. There's an orange bar above a character's HP, and they also have it within their kit. And in the constellation lineups of every Nautlon character, they get some sort of exploration benefit that is linked to Nightsoul. So it does in fact have applications for one of the other big parts of Genshin, because exploring is still the other half of the game at the end of the day. However, there are plenty of exploration-specific mechanics in Genshin already, so I'm not really sure why they couldn't have just used the orange bar. I will say that Nightsoul tends to have very cool effects, and it looks cool visually. I like the comic book effects. Okay, so that's all fine and dandy. We can acknowledge that Nightsoul isn't exactly the most enriching mechanic in the world. However, that doesn't mean very much if you're not able to suggest solutions, so let's talk about those. First off, Nightsoul bursts should be treated the same as Numa and Ouija, just something that happens to happen whenever you're playing a team that features Nautlon characters. It doesn't have to be any deeper than that, and it doesn't have to be tied to any special bar. That's already what happens anyways, but I don't think there needs to be a special bar to justify that happening. Secondly, if you want something to be Nautlon specific, you write that in text. This can only be used by Nautlon characters. This passive can only be used by Nautlon characters. There's no need to make it overly gimmicky and overcomplicate it. Just lay it out as it is. And secondly, try to choose a gimmick that already links to something in game mechanics. To be honest, I feel like they're already doing a perfectly good job at making the characters feel unique and different without the whole Nightsoul thing. The reason why Lolly's kit is cool and good has nothing to do with the fact that she does Nightsoul nonsense. Okay, yes, she can use 4-piece Cinder City, however, like I said earlier, if they changed that condition to be for Nautlon characters only, that wouldn't even change. Shilonen's kit is strong without any need of that Nightsoul nonsense. Well, to be fair, it is strong because of the Nightsoul consumption too now because of Moika, but if its restrictiveness didn't exist in the first place, then that wouldn't even matter. And I believe that for bosses like the Tenebra's Pupilla or any other bosses that really want you to use Nightsoul attacks on it, replace the Nightsoul attacks with triggering the occasional Nightsoul bursts. Basically the same as Numa and Ouija. Those were small mechanics, no one really paid a whole lot of mind to them. I don't really think anyone needs to pay a whole lot of mind to the fact that Nautlon characters are from Nautlon. I mean, I can kinda see why they did this. It fits thematically in the story, considering that, spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Nautlon characters aren't allowed to leave Nautlon, so by having all of the warriors grouped together, it kinda checks out. So thematically, it's fine, but I don't think that thematics should be a reason to deliver such a restrictive mechanic. For example, sure, Moika being a Pyro DPS absolutely fits her as a character and fits thematically. Does that mean that we needed another Pyro DPS? No. And to be honest, I feel like Nautlon already has the perfect gimmick that they're filling with every single release. The fact that every character that they're putting out has a super unique playstyle. Barring Shilonen, she is literally just Kazuhatu, but every other Nautlon release has been very unique in the way that they play. It's not just about Kinich being a burning DPS when we didn't have one before. It's about Kinich having a very unique lock-on style of gameplay where he circles around the foe and blasts at them. It's about Chaska flying during combat, that sort of thing. The unique team archetypes is also a very welcome addition, of course, but they already have this at their core. The characters fight in a very interesting way. I also feel like they could have made the fighting spirit thing a bigger deal than it is, but instead of locking it to only Nautlon characters, they could say, in order to get fighting spirit, you want to play them with either a Nautlon character or, and then insert what their kit works best with. For example, in order for Kinich to gain fighting spirit, he would either have to play with Nautlon characters or gain fighting spirit every whatever seconds whenever there's a burning aura present on the enemy. That sort of thing. They could make it very easily flexible. It might sound inflexible, but the only reason it sounds inflexible is because the way they executed it with Moika was a bit awkward. Normal attacks plus Nightsoul consumption. Okay then. But I do think the fighting spirit thing could have been cool because no ER requirement sounds like quite the blessing, to be honest. That sounds very, very fun. And yes, you do then run into the same restrictiveness problem, but I would say that's a whole lot more enriching and interesting than simply saying, nah, you gotta use them with Notlan characters. For the record, I do think that a lot of the kits that come out of Notlan have been really fun so far. I was more so thinking about Nightsoul and Isolation, not really the full character kits, which have all been a blast to use. I felt like the recent release of a legendary Moika really pointed out to me why I'm not a huge fan of Nightsoul. Here's hoping that the Nod Cry isn't going to be anywhere near as restrictive as those mechanics. But what do you think? Is Nightsoul actually perfectly fine in your opinion, or do you agree that it's a bit of a silly gimmick? Let me know down below in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, I have a ZZZ second channel. Head on over and subscribe if you're interested in some fun, silly ZZZ content. Hopefully this video was able to tell you why I'm not so fond of Nightsoul. This has been Juice, signing out. And wait until the next region asks for characters to use toothpaste that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend before they work in a team.